Good morning. You're here in the snow. I was expecting, 30 or 40 people in a church basement with lousy coffee, and here you all are. So it's a little bit of, oh man, I hope I'm not terrible. But Jason said, hey, would you chat about spiritual formation and emotional health? And a lot of my work is in that arena. And so I had a talk in the can that's kind of like, a pastoral leadership talk. But as I was starting to think about our time together, and Jason said, hey, there's more than a few people coming, I began to just kind of, as you do, listen to the Spirit in my heart. And so I put together some thoughts yesterday, and I got up early this morning, and in lieu of a run, it was a little snowy outside, so instead, I have some new thoughts. So this isn't all that put together, but I do want to chat to you around spiritual formation and emotional health, and anything I can do just to aid you in your journey. 30-something years, whoever you are, well done. How do we be here in this room that far in? I've been at our church for this year will be 17 years in since we planted. And 17 years, I think in church planting, it's like dog years. I think that's like 150, So I think, well, especially for millennial, well done. 17 years at anything, well done. But how do we stay in it, not just 17, but 30, 40, 50, and more than just stay in it, but how do we really grow and mature and thrive, and what does that even look like? And so let's chat about some of that. If you have a Bible, please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If you don't have a Bible, well, you're a pastor, so no, I'm kidding. 1 Corinthians 11, I just have a few, I'm not going to exegete a passage or whatever, but I just have a few thoughts based on Paul's insights into pastoral leadership and spiritual formation, and he would not use this language, but emotional health or whatever you want to call it. So I just want to take a look at a few things that Paul has to say about pastoral leadership and life with Jesus, and maybe draw a few insights for our experience here and now. Jesus, again, we're just so grateful for you, for your example, not just of how to die, but of how to live. Grateful for your easy yoke. We're grateful for your pace of life. We're grateful for your invitation to slow down and unhurry and live a life of abiding, of just resting in you as you come to rest in us. So Holy Spirit, even now on this beautiful winter day, with these wonderful people, would you just come and visit us with your sweet presence, your wisdom, your discernment. Have mercy on me and give us your peace. Amen. I love what Paul writes at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 11. In fact, if you want to back up a line or two, where there's a paragraph break in chapter 10, verse 31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble. That's a great word for pastors. Whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I'm not seeking my own good. We'll talk more about that later. But the good of many, so that they may be saved. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. It's an interesting line. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. For years, I read that line, and in all honesty, I thought it was a little bit pretentious, And in my pretty lousy, adolescent theology, it was, well, he can say that because he's Paul, as if somehow, writing the New Testament makes you superhuman or something like that. But I really have come full circle to think, if I can't say that, then I have no business being in leadership at a church. And notice, Paul does not say, live, perfect as I live perfect. He says, follow Jesus, kind of the way that I follow Jesus, and you will do well. Over the last number of years, we have rebuilt our church down in Portland around kind of all things spiritual formation, and I'm happy to take questions around that down the road. We still have more questions than answers. But one of the most difficult and I think hard-earned lessons that we have come to is very simple, and it's that leadership is about example and invitation, not coercion and control. And that, for me, I think due to my personality, that was a very hard lesson for me to learn. This whole thing, it's about example and invitation. Follow me as I follow Christ. You see that in Jesus, you see it in Paul, you see it in church history. It is not about coercion and control. And to lead in this kind of a way, we have to see ourselves, and this is so basic, but first as a follower and then as a leader, first as a practitioner and then as a teacher. We have to view our body and our life in our body as a living laboratory for the way of Jesus in our city and in our generation and in our time. Because if you think about it, the whole thing that we're trying to do is really form Christ in people. Turn over to Galatians chapter 4. Most of you know Paul's line in Galatians chapter 4. Let's just pick it up in verse 19. He writes, "My dear children," and there's that parental tone to leadership, right? That mother or father tone. But actually, it's the mother emphasis here. "For whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you." How I wish I could be with you and change my tone, because I am perplexed about you, which is what every parent would say to their child if they were Paul. I am perplexed about you. And every pastor would say that at times too. And I love Paul's vision of the end goal here is not to plant churches or deliver lectures. It's not to organize community. It's not to put on events. Those are all means to an end. The end is to mother people and nurture people and form Christ in people. It's spiritual formation. It's in Scott McKnight's most recent book on pastoring. He calls it Christoformity, which is just his language for Christ-likeness. It's to pastor people, to mother people or parent people or nurture people into Christoformity. And this is, of course, where we get our language of spiritual formation. It's literally from this Greek word right here, till Christ is formed in you. And that is our job. Whatever you do, if you're a children's pastor or lead pastor or sermon or worship or ops or whatever you do, the end goal of all of this is spiritual formation. And so everything we do is a means to that end. And I would define, of course, spirituality in the Jesus tradition as our capacity to receive and give love in relationship to God and others, which means that spiritual formation is the process by which we are formed into people with a greater and greater capacity to receive and to give love. And the tricky thing about spiritual formation, and this has been a steep learning curve for me, is unlike a lot of other stuff, including Bible, theology, and leadership, you really have to live it in order to teach it. So it's kind of like, it's more like karate than it is like philosophy. You know what I mean? Like, you don't know a lot of karate instructors who just read all the books and don't actually know how to do karate. You know what I mean? You go, because it's a practice. It's something that you do with your body. It's not just an idea or a concept. And the same is true with Jesus. You can't teach people how to follow Jesus. You know, the old adage, you can't take people somewhere you have not already gone yourself, or at least are en route to. You can't teach people how to follow Jesus if you have not actually, you don't have that in your muscle memory, which is a little bit different from, again, Bible and theology. And this is not a slant on that at all. But you can exegete, Philippians chapter 4 very well. Stay true to the text, draw out Paul's authorial intent, start with a good kind of catch to your sermon, end with a few very practical application points, and not actually be a non-anxious presence. And you can exegete Philippians 4, give yourself a day or two to study hard, you got it. Non-anxious presence, yeah, there goes 3 decades, But you can't teach somebody who's racked by anxiety and fear and is reactive and is addictive to technology and news and social media outrage how to become a non-anxious presence if you don't at some level have that in you. Turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 4, which of course is one of the pastoral letters, as you know, and I come back to Paul's letters to Timothy a few times a year. They're just so rich, and I feel like the more I read them, the more I fall in love with his wisdom. I think this is why Paul says this in 1 Timothy chapter 4, Verse 15, if you're down to the end of the chapter, be diligent in these matters, give yourself wholly to them, so that everyone may see your progress. That's really interesting language. So that everyone may see your progress. I started really young, and so one of the things I regularly hear from people is, I've really seen you mature, which is kind of a compliment, but I'll take it. And that's the downside to just, growing up in front of people. And when you're a leader, you're a person in process leading other people in process. And man, if there's not humility in that, I don't know where there is humility, But that's the idea, that people may see your progress, that people may journey with you and sit under your leadership or live in community with you over 5 years, 10, 15, 20, and see your progress. And of course, in Paul's rubric, that's the progress of spiritual formation, you becoming more and more like Jesus. And then he has this to say, watch your life. This is Paul's word to his young protege in pastoral leadership. Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and all your hearers, or all those that listen to you. If I'm reading Paul right, he's saying that in order for this end goal of progress into, Christoformity in our own life, much less in the people that we lead, number one, the most important thing is that we continue to progress and grow and mature in our own spiritual formation as we cultivate an emotionally healthy, if you want to use that language, a grounded, non-anxious, deep, prayerful, contemplative life of abiding that is active but not reactive. The next most important thing is our doctrine, that we think well of God, because we will become like our vision of God, for better or for worse, and the people that we lead will become like our vision of God, for better or for worse. And it's so imperative. The more I get into both biblical theology and spiritual formation and the psychological aspect of that, the more I come to the conviction that, man, what we think about God is the most important thing about us. Tozer said that years ago in Canada. And he said, it's because we tend by, quote, a secret law of the soul to move toward our mental image of God. Why is it that pastors who most emphasize the wrath of God are often known for not being nice? And pastors who emphasize the freedom of God are often known for being the least holy, right? There's just something to all of this. Like, we become like the vision. This is true. We could argue this from theology. We could argue this from church history. We could argue this from neurobiology. Like, all of the evidence is in. We become, through mirror neurons in our brain. I read there's a whole book, if you want to nerd out, called How God Changes the Brain. It's a whole new emerging field of science called neurotheology, where neuroscientists are doing deep research around religion, spirituality, Christian spirituality, and they tie it all to the mirror neuron in your brain. Think about when you look at somebody and they smile at you, what do? Unless if it's winter and really bad and you're really grumpy, most of the time, even if you're a laid-back Canadian or West Coast person, you smile back. That's the instinctive mirror neuron in your brain. This is true at every level. It's why when somebody walks into the room and is anxious, we feel a little anxious. Or is sad, we feel a little sad. Or is happy, it's like, oh, there's a type 7. We're like, oh, okay, everything's okay. And we feel this is like the same is true more than ever with God. We become like our vision of God. So watch your life, your soul, and your doctrine, how you think about God, very closely. And then that, unless if I'm doing the math wrong, that means the least important thing we do is develop leadership skills, which I think is where most people start, and in particular with an event like this, the kind of technique. Now, I could just be saying that because, honestly, I am a B- leader. I'm not a great leader. I get away with way too much due to our team and the mercy of God and the occasional sermon. But I have really, so I'm not here to give you this is how you lead really well. I'm not the guy that you should ask about that. But I have really come to believe that the greatest gift that we offer the people we lead, and this sounds pretentious and I don't mean it that way, is ourself. Ruth Haley Barton has that great line, and by the way, if you've not read her Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, has anybody read that? It's on a short list of books I read every year. It's just fantastic. But she has this line, the best gift you can give the people you lead is your transforming self. What a great line. And it's really weird grammar, your transforming self. But that's weird grammar, but very solid theology. Again, we're people in process leading others in process, not our transformed self, not like once I get my life all transformed, then let me pastor people. Our transforming self. And this is really the best gift that we give to our people, us at some level, emotionally healthy, present to God and our own body and the person in front of us, and doing what we were made by God to do. And the opposite is true. Jason and I were talking about this yesterday. The greatest threat to the people that you lead is yourself. I mean, that's just the hard truth. The greatest danger to the people you lead, I don't think is Satan. I don't think it's secularism. I don't think it's the iPhone. I don't think it's transience. I don't think it's the breakdown of the family or critical gender theory, though all of those are dangerous things. I think the greatest danger is me and you. We have more capacity to do harm and damage and wreak havoc in the people we lead, I think, than anybody else. So there is a reciprocal relationship between our emotional health, our maturity, our formation, the depth of our prayer life with Jesus, and that of the people that we lead. Pete Scazzaro says it so well in his little maxim, as the leaders go, so goes the church. I read his first book, Emotionally Healthy Church, which is actually my favorite of all of his, if you've not read the OG. But I read it when I was 23. It was the year we planted, and it was on Rob Bell's reading list back when he was like the coolest thing ever and was like exegeting Leviticus and Orthodox and stuff. And so I'm like, oh, this sounds like a weird book, Emotionally Healthy Church, okay. And so I read it, and I remember thinking, oh, this is great. But it literally went in one ear and out the other. And over the next 10 years, I did pretty much every single thing he said not to do. And then I came back to it at 33 on my sabbatical in a kind of early midlife crisis, burnout, feeling like a failure as a pastor and leader. And I read it again, and this time I was ready to receive what he had to say. And I just remember reading that opening line, as the leaders go, so goes the church, and think, oh, well, yeah, that's the problem. Like, I'm not well. Why would I expect the people that I lead to be well? And he's right. I mean, his little insight is that a church will rarely rise, not never, but rarely rise above the level of health, maturity, and formation of its core leaders and leadership team. So all I really want to wrap with you today about is how do we kind of watch our life and doctrine closely and persevere in them. It's an interesting line from Paul, persevere in them. We're in this for the long haul. How do we stay in the room decades in? And how do we not just stay in it, but again, grow and mature in our capacity to receive and to give love? I'm 39, I turn 40 soon, and I'm just at that age where a number of the leaders that I came up with are gone. Over the last 10 years, a number of kind of celebrity pastors have gone the way of whatever, and then a number of non-celebrity pastors. We all know people that aren't on the front page of the New York Times, but it's the same exact kind of story, just not famous. And, I think most of them are lost to one of the three great threats to our generation, or maybe this is every generation, but in particular to ours. One, to lousy theology, which for most people in our generation, and I mean that in the broad sense, is progressive theology, or a more biblical way to say that is compromise with the world. Or two, moral failure, some kind of a mistake that you don't come back from, or you don't come back from fast, often sexual, but not always. And three is burnout. Just people just get tired, or the marriage is tired, or people are just worn out. And those three things, by the way, all go together. But the interesting thing about that last one, about burnout, is that one comes for everybody. Even if you have impeccable theology, even if you are a moral exemplar at some level, burnout, man, it will still haunt you. That one comes across theological lines, across denominational lines, across generational lines, across urban, suburban lines. It comes for everybody. And, just the question we have to ask is, man, how do we persevere in Paul's language? How do we stay in this and not get, sidetracked by one of the big three, by, lousy progressive theology, or by moral failure, or by, far more dangerous for most of us, just good old-fashioned burnout. And leadership, I'm not here to give you a pep talk. Leadership is hard in my experience. Pastoral leadership is harder still. And pastoral leadership in the day and age of cancel culture and PC and polarization and secularism and post-Christian hostility, gosh, that's not an easy task. So how do we stay in this for the long term? Well, just three kind of things I want to chat to you about this morning. I think about it through layers, kind of three layers. Let me just wrap a little bit about each one: lifestyle, personality, and inner work. First off, I think, is just crafting a sustainable lifestyle. We have this saying that we throw around back home: if you want to experience the life of Jesus, you have to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. This is based on Jesus' famous line in Matthew 11, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, take my yoke upon you, and I will give you my rest." And, that's it. I grew up in the church, and I'm not a first century Jewish farmer, so it's easy for me to forget what odd imagery that is of, an easy yoke. We would say something like a relaxing tractor or something like that. And if you translate it that way, you're like, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. Frederick Dale Bruner, who's one of the top scholars in the world right now on the Gospel of Matthew, in his commentary writes this: a yoke is a work instrument. Thus, when Jesus offers a yoke, he offers what we might think tired workers need least. They need a mattress or a vacation, not a yoke. You know what I mean? They're like, I want a condo in Kauai, not a tractor. That's not how I want to deal with the burnout in my soul. But Jesus realizes, this is a really great insight, that the most restful gift he can give the tired, and many of you in the room are tired, is a new way to carry life, a fresh way to bear responsibilities. Realism sees that life is a succession of burdens. We cannot get away from them. Thus, instead of offering escape, Jesus offers equipment. Jesus means that obedience to his Sermon on the Mount, his yoke, in the context of Matthew, will develop us in a balance and a way of carrying life that will give more rest than the way we have been living. A lot of people view emotional health as a kind of escape from the burden and the responsibility and the pressure and the hard work of life and leadership. It's not an escape, and there's no silver bullet. But there is a way to carry life that is sustainable over a long haul, that is based on the lifestyle of Jesus. And Willard, in his work on this, called Matthew 11 the secret of the easy yoke. That was his insight. And his basic insight was that what a lot of us try to do is we read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, we read the Sermon on the Mount, or just insert, whatever teaching of Jesus or Paul or whatever you have in your mind, and then we just go out and we try to live it. We just go out and try to love our enemies, or try to not worry anymore, or try to not lust or whatever. But we live the rest of our life the way that everybody else in Vancouver does, or our generation does. We spend our money, we spend our time, we interact with our phone and the internet and Netflix, we do relationships. We just most of our life, other than the moral stuff, is the same as everybody else. And then he just writes, quote, "that is a strategy bound to fail." If we attempt as pastors to go out and do all the stuff that Jesus did, teach and preach and heal the sick and cast out demons and start communities and stand up against religious corruption and do justice, all the things that we do, but then we don't adopt Jesus' overall lifestyle, we don't follow his example, we just kind of live the way that most people our age do, in our city do, that is, quote, a strategy bound to fail. And one of the first things, if you want to just kind of summarize Jesus' rhythm and what made it sustainable for him, is I think one of the first things that you realize about Jesus is this rhythm of retreat and return. Whatever you want to call that, retreat and return, where Jesus would just oscillate back and forth between kind of retreat, time alone to regather himself to God in the quiet and prayer, time with close friends, rest, sleeping, Sabbath, and then return, re-engage, teach, preach, heal the sick, cast out demons, rebuke, get into fights, offer a prophetic word, do all the things, and then he would disappear again. And this rhythm of retreat and return is in all four Gospels Gospels. It's painfully obvious on the page. I love Luke's little summary quote from chapter 5. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Man, can that be said of you? Sarah, John, Will, Jason often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. In fact, I would argue that the more in demand, if I'm reading Luke in particular right, the more in demand that Jesus was, the more responsibility that was on him, the more influence, the more he snuck away to pray, rest, sleep, process with friends, grieve, feel his emotions, process, discern, and get direction from God. Often we go the exact opposite direction. I just read Elton Trueblood's autobiography last week over the Christmas break, if you know him, 20th century Quaker. And he had this great line about how the more public a leader is, the more you have to learn how to hide. And he based that on Jesus' example. And there's really something there. This is a lesson, again, I have had to learn this the hard way, and I'm still in process on learning this one. I have a couple, I'm not into sports, but I have a number of, we all have friends who are all about sports and want to talk about it all the time. But apparently there's this massive debate. I've been learning a lot about kind of I think there's a lot of parallels between athleticism and some of what we do. And apparently there's this massive debate in the NBA right now over load management. And where there's this whole thing where the key players, like actually the better they get and the more important they are to the team, actually the more they have to rest. But this is a massive problem because if you pay to go see, the Blazers or whatever your team of choice is, and you show up and the star player is like on the sideline just resting his soul, so that he can be a good husband and not hurt his knee and be really present for the next game. You're like, what? I just paid. Aren't tickets expensive? Aren't they like really spending? I don't know, they are. I just paid whatever I paid, $60 or whatever, to see so-and-so and he's not there, And my therapist actually used the analogy of baseball, and I don't know anything about baseball, but at all. This is dangerous. I'm not even sure I understood him at the right way. But the metaphor was true, whether or not it was true. But he used the analogy of a pitcher in baseball. Apparently, a pitcher is different than a basketball player in that, the more important a pitcher is, the less they can actually pitch, and they're a great threat to throw out their arm. So once they get to the World Series, it's this big psychological game where, that pitcher can't actually play all of those games. So it's this like give and take, like the person that helped get the team there can't actually play all of the games. And so there's this big, thing, psychology around it or whatever. And he basically said, you've been thinking that the more responsibilities put on you, the more influence you have, the more God's blessing is on you, the more you need to do. Actually, it's the exact opposite. You need to do less now than you have ever done. And you need to spend more time in prayer, rest, quiet. I was reading a fascinating book last week on Olympians, and it said that the difference, once you get to that highest tier of athletics, the difference between the elites and just the really good athletes is not how hard they work, it's how much they rest. They all train, it said, pretty much at the same level of intensity, and many of them have the same level of talent. What separates the Olympian from the great is how seriously they take rest, recovery, care, soul care, spirituality, things like that. So I cannot, many of you are young in the room, and you'll have at least for a little while, it goes away, but this sense of like upward mobility, trust me, it doesn't last, but you'll have this sense of, more responsibility, more influence, more whatever. I cannot encourage you more. I work less hours now than I've ever worked, and I spend more time resting and in prayer than I ever have. And I still feel like it's not enough. I recently read Ordering Your Private World by Gordon MacDonald. Anybody read that? I'd not even heard of it, and apparently sold 1 million copies. He is from Denver Seminary, was a pastor for many, many years in New York. And beautiful, beautiful book. It's a bit dated now, but still very good. But the best line in the entire book, I don't have a slide for you, but let me just read this to you. He writes this, Jesus knew his limits well. That's a good insight. Do you know your limits well? You're like, yeah, I know them really well, and I blow past them every day. Jesus knew his limits well. Strange as it may seem, he knew what we conveniently forget. Here's the best line in the book. Time must be properly budgeted for the gathering of inner strength and resolve, in order to compensate for one's weaknesses when spiritual warfare begins. Let me read that to you again, since we don't have a slide. Time must be properly budgeted for the gathering of inner strength and resolve in order to compensate for one's weaknesses when spiritual warfare begins. He calls this time budgeting, which is a pretty simple concept. It's what Willard means by lifestyle. It's what the ancients called a rule of life. So level one, I just think, to like long-term health and how do we not burn out and get off track, I think level one is just crafting a rule of life, or whatever you want to call it, lifestyle or whatever, that is sustainable. We hear, a lot that ministry is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And there's truth in that, but I actually think an even better analogy would be to say that ministry is like a track relay race. It's like intense output followed by deep breathing and rest. That's my experience. You don't run a marathon for 50 years, I think it's more like a relay race. Let me take the baton, intense output. Let me give everything that I have in the Spirit of God to this event, this sermon, this leadership team, this moment, this spiritual direction encounter, and then rest, breathing, come back to myself. It's living in that kind of a healthy rhythm. Now, you have to craft a rule that's based on, there's no right way to do this because you have to craft a rule that's based on your personality, on your stage of life, on the level of freedom that you have in your job. It has to be countercultural to the city you live in, the generation you live in. For example, a rule of life nowadays has to include a digital component. So I have a digital rule of life that's like an addendum to my rule of life, and we just have taken our church through this and have asked our entire church, you write it yourself, here's a few ideas, but write up a digital rule of life for your own life in Jesus. That's not something that even 10 years ago people needed to have that. Now, I honestly, not in the Bible, it's not a moral or biblical thing, but I think we need to have a digital rule of life, and it has to be based on your call and all of that. So there is no one size fits all approach. Just if you're curious, a few key practices in my rule of life are morning prayer. I just spend a long time every morning, but when I say morning prayer, I don't mean I'm up at 4 a.m. interceding for revival and speaking in tongues naked on the roof in winter in the rain. What I mean by prayer is it looks suspiciously like drinking coffee in a quiet room and just letting God love me, And it feels more like resting than working. And that's not a slam on intercessory prayer. But I do most of that actually with other people. I do most of that with my team, not by myself. Most of my prayer life is just spent kind of resting in God, listening, doing my best to focus my mind, which is all over the map, doing my best just to hear from God a sense of direction or conviction or discernment or whatever is on hand. Morning prayer is massive for me. Sabbath is huge for me. I do my best to spend a day every month in prayer. Even if it's like I can't go away overnight, which is my ideal. There's a monastery about a 50-minute drive. Attempt to go there whenever I can. But even if I can just get up early and, in the summer, I'll drive out to this little spot and I'll just park my car and I'll come back at dinner time and just spend the day with Jesus in prayer and journaling and thinking and planning. Long vacations, I'm a big believer that with our job, there's something about that Sunday after Sunday after Sunday rhythm, in particular those of you that are on an aspect of the church that is kind of Sunday heavy, that is just, there's an emotional drain to that. You know what I mean? It's like, remember that Andy Stanley video a couple years ago, Sunday is coming, It's like, how many of you are driving home? We have Sunday night gatherings. I would literally be driving home and my first thought after, I made it is, next Sunday. It's almost worse when you had a good Sunday or a good sermon and you're like, no, I got to bring the heat again, Or and then if it's bad, you're like, I have to redeem my self-worth now, whatever. That's not mature, by the way, just to clarify. That's not how you handle that. Reading is a huge one for me. Relationships, with my kind of trifecta of community that I do life with, therapist and mentor to help me with that stuff, and then deep friendships. That's been really life-giving for me. Some of you know I'm a part of a little group of guys that we spend a week together every spring. It's about 13 of us, and we've just committed to kind of doing life together as friends. We're all lead pastors of churches. And it's been the most life-giving thing I think one of the most life-giving things I've ever done in leadership. And it's a really easy model. We fly in, have dinner together, and then we spend one day with an older, wiser, kind of just person that we want to be like when we grow up. This year we have Ronald Rolheiser coming in, which is not to drop names, but he's like a hero of mine. I'm going to fanboy out hard. I'm picking him up from the airport, and I'm going to be like, oh, he's going to have to pull the angel in Revelation. Don't bow down to me. I, too, am a messenger of God. So it should be pretty spectacular. I really, really appreciate his work. And then we'll do a day just kind of best practices or helping each other. Or sometimes, we'll do like a Quaker listening committee, helping each other make decisions, and then a day just together. And the beauty of that model is like anybody can do it. A 22-year-old youth pastor with $75 can do this. You're not going to have Ronald Rolheiser, but you know what I mean? You can like take your aunt's cabin or rent an Airbnb and get some older, wiser pastor in the city to come sit with you for a day, and pick 5 or 10 other youth pastors that you want to at least commit to for 5 or 10 years, if not a lifetime, and just help each other grow and mature and be like Christ and be good wives or husbands and be good leaders and follow and help each other make decisions and discern should you stay or go or plant or not, or you know what I mean? That for me, which is that annual trip is a core part of my rule of life, and I think it's such an easy and replicatable model. So there's a few things in my rule of life that are very life-giving. I'm happy to take questions on that later, though it's pretty basic stuff. Second layer, that's just layer one, all right? So you're like, we're going to be here forever. I'll go faster. That's just layer one. But there's still another layer that I would just say is discovering kind of our identity and calling. If it's true that the best gift you give the people you lead is your transforming self, as Barton says, then it stands to reason that you need to know who you are and who it is that you are becoming or are not becoming. I love that story in John 1 of John the Baptist when the Pharisees come to him, are you the Messiah? No. Are you Elijah? No. Are you the prophet? No. Who are you? Quote from Isaiah, I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness. That's like the dream, to have that level of clarity around who we are and who we're not. And out of that identity, a sense of calling, what we're called to do and what we're not called to do. And that then gave him the humility to a few paragraphs later, and the freedom and the capacity to a few paragraphs later say, he must increase and I must decrease. Literally my ministry can dissipate and disappear and I can end up in prison, and that's okay because I know who I am and I know what I'm called to do. And that's inside what God has set me for. That's a high level of self-awareness. But that's the dream, is that we grow and mature to that point. In the 15th century, the Spanish mystic Saint Teresa of Avila, who I've just been reading a lot of her stuff lately, and a lot of wisdom in that woman, she put it this way, quote, almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge. That's one of those statements that feels like an overstatement. Almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge, until you actually sit with it for a while and let it work on your mind, and you're like, oh yeah. Yes, 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 yes. I think you could say the same about leadership. Almost all problems in spiritual leadership stem from a lack of self-knowledge. We really need, and this is not just Teresa or my opinion, you hear this as a refrain all through the great luminaries of church history, men and women from across the spectrum, that, a really good high level of self-awareness, a deep sense of who you are and who you're not, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, the good, the bad, the ugly, honesty about it without hiding from yourself or self-deception. And human beings are masters of self-deception. And I think our in Christness, the love of Christ for us as we are, is the greatest gift, because we can actually explore the full range of our personhood before God with no excuses, no hiding, no shame, and experience his love, and yet come to actually realize who we are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so many of the great leaders have said you have to have this sense. Otherwise, on the negative, for two reasons. On the negative side, if you don't have a high sense of self-awareness, you will just cause great damage to the people you lead. It's the famous, Rumi poet line, if you're here with us unfaithfully, you're doing great harm. And, if you look at most, it's been really, the pastoral celebrity pastor scandals of the last decade have been really interesting because so many of them have not been the classic, like, so-and-so had an affair or stole money from the church. So many of them have just been ego, ambition, domineering leadership, manipulative practices, not treating people with kindness, hurry, busyness, exhaustion, burnout, overload. Most of the time, it was somebody leading out of a low sense of self-awareness and leading a lot of the times from a father wound. I mean, like many of you, I keep meeting people and I know more and more pastors. I cannot tell you how many of the most well-known leaders of churches are living from deep father wounds. I mean, deep. The percentage, and this is true, I've heard this is way higher for CEOs, that if you look at CEOs, almost all of them have horrible relationships with their dads. And you think, man, who would sacrifice their life? Who would work 90 hours a week and like pretty much have a guarantee you're not going to stay in any marriage long term and your kids are not going to want anything to do with you and you're just going to sacrifice your soul? Often it's people that are living out of this deep wound, this deep sense of how they don't feel like that they're enough, that they're loved as they are. And so I have to accomplish, I have to accumulate, or they're just so scared of losing control, so they control other people. And they're so racked by that anxiety because they've been hurt in the past, or they can't attach because they were never loved and nurtured. And so they're just cold and hot and cold and people can't connect with them. And my point is not that if you have a father wound, you can't be in leadership any more than if you have sin, you can't be in leadership. All of us are people in process, leading people in process. It's that if you don't have self-awareness, you are a disaster waiting to happen. And so it's so important that before the loving gaze of God and through community, which is really the two, we'll really discover who we are through listening prayer with God. As we get to know God, we get to know ourselves, as we hold ourselves up and we mirror to him in the ways that we're like him and not like him, and through community, where just all of your stuff will come out in any kind of in-close interpersonal relationship. So marriage, family, community around a table, best friends, where people actually know you as you are, not the projection of you, but who you actually are. Who you are will actually come out. And then on the positive side, so the negative side, we have to do this work so that we don't like drag our shadow side and project it onto other people and hurt people. But on the positive side, we have to do this because, so many of us are just trying to fit into a stereotype that we're not. This is so like, you hear this all the time, but we need to hear it more. I specifically remember years ago, I was wrestling with my job and the size of our church, and I was all angsty about Sunday-centric church and all this stuff. And I just read The Pastor by Eugene Peterson and was obsessed with him. And at one point, my therapist, who's this very, 70-something PhD Quaker guy, he's great. He's not very like rebuke kind of guy, you know what I mean? He's a therapist. But at one point, he just stopped me and he said, "John Mark, you are not Eugene Peterson, nor should you be." And it was just this like loving rebuke. And I was like, oh yeah. I met Eugene. He was like the mellowest person I've ever met in my entire life. That's not who I am. And he's wonderful, and I adore him. But, oh yeah, that's a different call than Mike. And he translated the Bible. I'm not doing that anytime soon, and then he just had this great insight. He said, mentors are only helpful in so much they mirror back to us God's call on our own life. Otherwise, they can actually be really dangerous, because we start to pattern our life not just after a lifestyle, which is great. I'm always asking pastors, what's your morning routine? What's your rule of life? How are you handling email? What's your staff meeting? Asking all those lifestyle questions. But then we start to pattern our life after their identity and calling, when we might have a very different identity and a very different calling. And then we just expend all of this energy trying to be somebody we're not. Parker Palmer, in his beautiful little book, Let Your Life Speak, if you've read that, about the seasons of life, he tells his story of burnout, and he just has this great little line about how sometimes burnout isn't a function of giving too much. It's a function of giving something that's not ours to give in the first place. Meaning we think burnout is just, I work too many hours and I need a vacation. But I know lots of people that work 40 hours a week and still burn out. I know other people that work 70 hours a week, I don't, and seem full of life and energy and passion and vitality. And some of that's personal capacity, and we're all different on that. I don't have that kind of a capacity. But a lot of it is what people are doing. And we all know that. You'll do, and none of us have the great job. I was with John Ortberg recently, and we were chatting about this and my angst, because I really feel like I should just be a teacher and do spiritual direction, not lead a church. And he's somewhat similar, and he kind of got sucked into church leadership when he wanted to be a teaching pastor. And, but he was so relaxed about it. He wasn't all angsty like me. And he said, I don't really like leadership, but I'm really interested in growth. And he said, nothing will show me how much I need to grow like leading other people. And I was like, that's very true and very mature. He's like, I want to grow to be more like Christ. And just every time I lead, I see all the ways that I'm not. And it just throws it in my face. And then he said, there's no role out there where you get it and you're just like, everything is perfect. You have the perfect job, He said, if you can get within 80%, you're killing it. And he said, just try at some point to get within 80%. There's always going to be a chunk of your job, your life, your role that's outside of your gift set. And, if 80% of your job is outside of your identity and calling, that's a problem. But if 20% is outside, that's just life, And I think, how do we move that dial toward that end? Now, obviously, this is a lot harder for those of you that are young and don't have that same freedom and privilege to kind of pick what I want to do. There's nothing worse like when the 22-year-old's like, I don't really want to do that job. I'd rather do this one. Like, sorry, So it's like, sorry, it's a bummer, but you have to kind of do the job you have to get the job you want, And I was a first through third grade pastor for a number of, can you imagine that? And then I was a youth pastor. What kind of heinous, cruel, satanic joke was that on those poor children, And that was not my identity and calling, but that was my job. And there was something good about that for me. Cal Newport, if anybody read Cal Newport's work, Deep Work is the one I recommend everybody. But his book before that is called So Good They Can't Ignore You, which is great. It's based on a Steve Martin line when he was asked, how do you make it in your career? And he said, be so good they can't ignore you. And it's a book about excellence and how excellence is more important than passion, that being really good at your job is far more important and rewarding than having a job that you're passionate about. And he does all the data on that. Really, and basically, it's like an anti-Steve Jobs commencement speech, a book. It's really good. But in it, he has this idea of vocational equity, that the better you get at your job and the longer you keep at it, the more you accrue what he calls vocational equity. The more you accrue the ability to kind of actually eventually do the job that you really want and that you really feel, and we would use the language of called for and made to do. And this is not something that happens in like a year or two. If anybody's read Bobby Clinton's work on the making of a leader, has anybody read that? That's one of the few, that's a leadership book I would say everybody should read. He has this idea, the last kind of stage, he has a six-stage development pattern for spiritual leadership. And I think the second to last one is what he calls convergence, which is just where your job and your experience and your identity and calling all like converge and come together. And you're just like in some kind of a role, a ministry, leadership possession where like it just maximizes, you're doing what God made you to do. Some people get there in their 20s, most people get there in their 50s. The point is just to move toward that, wherever you are at in that spectrum. So get within 80%. So layer one, lifestyle. Layer two, kind of discovering your identity and personality. And then finally, as we end, is just what I would call layer three is just doing the inner work. Doing the inner work. One of the hard lessons I've had to learn, and again, I don't think I'm a natural leader, is painfully obvious, and it's just that life is really good, but life is really hard. M. Scott Peck, in his beautiful book, The Road Less Traveled, which is one of my favorites, his opening line is, life is difficult. And that sounds really dour, and it's actually not. And then he says this great insight, when you expect life to be easy, it's really hard. But when you expect life to be difficult, then actually it's very doable and beautiful before God. And I say that because I think there's a myth that at least I buy into in my idealism, and a lot of leaders are idealists, and it's what makes us good at our job, and it's our Achilles heel. Because people are not ideal. Life is not ideal. Church is not ideal. It's messy and it's human, and people don't do what they should do, and we don't do what we want to do, and the whole thing's a mess and beautiful. But the idealism can be really dangerous. It can be violent at times. But I read an interesting interview with him where because what got him started as a clinical psychologist was the question of the problem of evil in the 20th century. How could the most advanced civilization in human history, in Germany in particular, and then later in Russia and other places, create the greatest genocide in human history and do so much evil? And he, in the 80s, he bought up apparently all of this Soviet art, like Soviet propaganda from communist regimes, and he put it all over a room in his house. And apparently it just creeps people out when they like walk into this room, and it's just Stalin everywhere and red graphic design of like the hand and the fist, you know? And he said he put it there to remind himself, though, that he would never forget, this is what happens when human beings attempt to create utopia. And there's an idealism that I'm prone to. I actually have the same personality type as all three of the famous communist leaders. So there's that. That's great. Like you ever like Google famous, whatever your Myers-Briggs type is, and it's like Karl Marx, Joseph Stalin, and Lenin. Awesome. Great. Somebody else is like Reese Witherspoon or whatever, you know. And I'm like, oh, the genocide people, you know. Great. But they were all idealists. They could visualize this unrealized future, and they didn't test it. They didn't practice it. They didn't live it. They tested it on live subjects, and it was a disaster. It just wreaked havoc in people's life. So I say that. Idealism is dangerous, and I think the idealism is, hey, if we can just nail our lifestyle and then just get a kind of high self-awareness and a role where we're really doing what we're made to do, no burnout, no temptation, we're going to do great, we're just going to be happy all the time, we're going to be full of life and energy, we're never going to get tired and burned out, we're just going to kill it for 60 years. I think that's idealism. Life is hard. What you realize is you kind of get your lifestyle in order, massive help. Then you kind of grow in self-awareness, and you mitigate against your shadow side through community and help and soul healing, and you kind of work your way over many years into a job that's really in line with your gift set and how God wired you and your temperament. Massive help. And then you realize, oh, but life is still hard. That doesn't solve all my problems. There's no silver bullet. There's no 3-step formula. There's no like download this rule of life off of this website and never burn out. Like there's all this inner stuff. And that's where, again, Ortberg, I don't really like leadership, but I like growth. And leadership is a great way to grow. There's this constant invitation to kind of do this inner work. And 3 things, let me just end here. If you want to turn over to Thessalonians, I'll just read this really fast to you, just a few pages to the left. Paul has this great line I've been thinking about a lot. In Thessalonians, verse 2, right at the very beginning, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 2. We always thank God for all of you, and we'll end here. We continually mention you in our prayers. We remember before our God and Father, and here's his beautiful tripart observation: your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. Man, I've been thinking a lot about this lately. Work produced by faith, labor prompted by love, and endurance inspired by hope. And I've been thinking about how often my work is not produced by faith, my labor is not prompted by love, and my endurance, or lack thereof, is not inspired by hope. Often my work is not prompted by or produced by faith, but by anxiety and a need to control. Faith, so many scholars now argue that a much better English translation is the word trust. Whatever you want to call pistis, faith and trust, or fidelity is another translation. It is a kind of trust and confidence and fidelity to God's presence, goodness, and involvement in our leadership and life. When our work is produced by faith, we work from this place of inner calm and tranquility and confidence that God is with us and for us and ahead of us. And I love Eugene Peterson's insight into Genesis chapter 1. Have you read that? Where he writes about, in biblical theology, the day starts with sleep. It was evening and it was morning on the first day, and the week starts with Sabbath. Just think, and then he argues that that's God teaching justification by grace through faith from page 1 in the Bible. Your day starts with sleep. your week starts with rest. And then he just says, when I wake up and go to work, I wake up to a story of what God already has been doing, not just while I was asleep, but for thousands or millions of years. I read a fascinating, I was listening to a fascinating podcast with a neuroscientist who's a sleep expert, and he said, we can't figure out sleep because it makes no evolutionary sense. So when they try to interpret sleep through evolutionary biology, it doesn't make sense, because if you think about an animal that's sleeping, they're vulnerable to attack, wild animal disease. It's very dangerous. They can't make sense of it. Why did human beings evolve in the universe to sleep? I'm like, yeah, because God was teaching justification by grace through faith. Come on. Don't you know that, Mr. Neuroscientist? You know? Man, the day starts with sleep. The week starts with rest. We wake up to what God is. I think of what Jesus said, my Father is always working. I always do what pleases the Father. You rest, you sleep. You're not God, you're you, I'm me. We play our small part. We join the Father in what he's already doing. The opposite of this kind of working from trust and confidence and limitations and rest and peace is working from anxiety. And when we lead from a place of anxiety, what if God's not with me? What if it doesn't go well? What if they hate me? What if it's a failure? What if it doesn't come together? What if my identity isn't validated by success? Whatever it is, even if it's at a subconscious for most of us level, not conscious. When we lead from this place of anxiety and its twin, which is anger, and those two go together, we lead in a manner of domination. We seek to manipulate and control other people, whether it's through alpha male kind of domination leadership or passive aggressive thing, which is far more common and just as corrosive, though it's more socially acceptable. Our staff has this little saying we've come up with over a number of years now of trying to do spiritual formation with the whole church. They just say, coercion is not a fruit of the Spirit. I like that. It's true. Coercion, Paul's like love, joy, peace, patience, making people do what you know they need to do to grow. That's not on his list, coercion, you know? And the more, and this is where leadership, this is a whole other sermon I'm not going to rant on, but I really think that faith, and I think the better word is trust, is the core of the spiritual life, even before we get to love. Because I don't think we actually can become loving people until we've come to trust in Jesus and let go of our need for control. Until we can let go of the need for our life and our leadership to go a certain way for us to be safe, happy, and at peace, we will inevitably lead in such a way that we attempt to manipulate and coerce the people and events of our life to make them what we think they need to be for us to feel safe and happy. And we will do great damage. And we will burn out because it's exhausting, because you can't control people. And if there's anything you're going to learn really fast as a pastor, it's you're not in control. You're just not. Any kind of leadership, parenting, doesn't matter. You're not in control. Example, invitation, that's all you have. So work produced by faith, and then labor prompted by love. Often my labor is not prompted by love, definitely not by agape, which I would just define as to will the good of another ahead of your own. It's prompted by ego or ambition, and any subfacet of that, greed, desire for notoriety, fear, insecurity that often if we're actually honest, and most of us don't even want to be honest with ourselves, much less other people, what drives us, and we really is a drivenness, is not agape. It's egoic ambition. It's some desire for something else. And when we're run by these kinds of egoic motivations, we are a danger to others, as we're more likely to operate out of anxiety and domination and control and manipulation and those kind of tactics of leadership. But we're also a danger to ourselves and to burnout, because it's not a sustainable thing. There's just to live by the social Darwinism of how do I make it? There will always be somebody more successful than us, more intelligent than us, cooler than us, better than us, more Christ-like than us. That comparison will just corrode and oxidize all of our joy and confidence and contentment. So as long as we're in bondage to our ego and driven by self-interest, we will cause great harm to other people, and we will just hollow and burn out our own soul. We have to come to this place of first inner freedom and trust, where we just detach and release the illusion of control and have faith in God. And then God has to move us. And one way of framing the whole spiritual journey is this kind of moving off of the egoic operating system to a life of agape. That's one way of looking at the 100 years of your life. Every child comes out of the womb 100% run by egoic operating system. I want what I want now. It's all about what I want, what I feel, what I need, what I'm hungry for, what I'm thirsty for. I don't get what I want, I cry and I scream. All of us are that way. Some people never mature beyond that. They just grow more sophisticated, but they're still in that same level of egoic operating system at 82. Other people become, over many years of discipleship to Jesus and spiritual formation, free to a greater and greater degree of that, to become people who are more and more run by agape, run by self-giving, just the flow of the Trinitarian community of God's love through you to other people, even if it comes at great cost to yourself. And then lastly, that's endurance inspired by hope. Often my endurance, or just sticking at it or staying in my job and role, is not inspired by hope. It's just run by cynicism and striving. Those will not get you very far, very long. That just kind of, I'm going to stay at it, probably not going to go great, but I'm Canadian, we're all cynical, so what the heck, you know? I can say that because it's no different down south. But man, that's not a sustainable way. And so to end, just read what he says next with me. For you know, brothers and sisters, verse 4, loved by God. What beautiful language. He's chosen you because our gospel came to you not simply with words, but also with power, with the Holy Spirit and deep conviction. You know how we lived among you. There's the example and invitation. For your sake, there's a life motivated not by ego, but by agape. And you became imitators of us. Same exact idea again. This is his paradigm. And of the Lord. Follow me as I follow Christ. For you welcomed the message. People chose to say yes. Not all people choose to say yes. What made this church unique was they chose to say yes. In the midst of severe suffering. This is not an easy life. Everything is hard. With the joy given by the Holy Spirit. But it's rich and good and beautiful, and I'm so grateful. And then here's one of my favorite lines in the New Testament. And so you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. The Lord's message rang out from you, not only in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. Your faith in God, that's a heretical translation, but Eugene Peterson did it. Your faith in God has become known everywhere. This church in Thessalonica was a model, literally, to the church in the known world for its work produced by faith, its labor prompted by love, its endurance inspired by hope, which was in turn built on the model of Paul's life and leadership. There was just a man who planted a church who said, follow me as I follow Christ. A person who was in process, leading others in process. He said yes, others said yes. And the result was a model church. That's really the dream for your church, for mine, for the church in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think God sees the border the way that we see the border. For all of us stuck up here in the rain, just to end with some cynicism, God is with us. May we live in the power of the Holy Spirit.